So I had a class designed that was going to be super complicated, different. Well, first of all, I should say, I'm Dan Weiss. This is my 16th year teaching here. And as you guys have heard me say before, when I first came here, our adult education program was usually 3 or 4 people. And so I got involved, and a bunch of us decided to change how we were doing adult education. And so we've been doing a lot of things. I've taught classes on archaeology, music, Joe can probably help me with this, food, Old Testament stuff, New Testament, 12-part series on historical Jesus, supersessionism, Jesus the Jew, secularism last year. And this year I had some great ideas, and I proposed them, everybody bought into them, and then in July I changed my mind. So, and this is what the result is. And I had another class all designed and ready to go, but then I had a couple of things happen and it made me change my mind. The first one was in our trip to Israel. We were offered one night to go underground and to go see the stones that were built during Herod's time, and to see it firsthand. Not everybody gets to do it. I've been 3 times to Israel, and this was a second time we got to do it. Joe's been 4 times. She's done it a couple of times. It's very cool. And we had someone on the trip, a pastor, who said he wasn't going to do it. And when I was asking why he wasn't going to do it, he said he came to see about Jesus, not about Herod. And when I was talking to the group, it dawned on me while I was talking that you can't understand Jesus if you don't understand Herod, and that the two are very much connected. Herod established the conditions for what Israel was when Jesus was there. And you know, we talk about the traditional belief that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. Well, being 100% man means that he lived within a particular context and he was who he was at a particular time. So that was one thing that happened and made me think, maybe I should go back to the basics for a class sometime this year. And then I had a second incident happen, and that is a friend of mine who's evangelical Christian, who's assistant pastor at a very large church in Georgia. He sent me a note saying, I can't remember the reason for this, but do you know why the Jews quit doing sacrifices? And I said, sure, and I wrote the Great Jewish Revolt. And then he wrote me back a note and said, what is the Great Jewish Revolt? And I was like, and then I thought, I wonder if there are other people who don't know what the Great Jewish Revolt is, because you can't understand Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and much else that's in the New Testament if you don't understand the Great Jewish Revolt. And then I had a third incident, which was I sat in church and listened to someone talk about the resurrection. It was a pastor, and he described the resurrection in great detail. And what he explained was nothing like the Jewish notion of what a resurrection is all about. He explained the Greek notion about a soul that leaves our body and goes up to heaven or to some other place. Not the idea that the Jews had of your body actually being reconstituted and being resurrected. And so I was thinking there, this is someone who knows nothing about Antiochus Epiphanes and the abomination of desolation. And then I started thinking, I bet you there are people at my church who don't know about Antiochus Epiphanes
I can't even pronounce it.
and the abomination of desolation. You will be able to pronounce it by the end of this class today. So what we're doing is, in the next 3 weeks, we're going to establish the context for who Jesus is. And a third thing, actually, when I was starting to put this thing together, a subject that's of great interest to me is recontextualization. And this is where you have 2 different things, and you're usually introduced to something you're not familiar with, and then you take something else that you are familiar with and you put it together. For instance, if you go on a trip, you're in a new place, almost always someone says, this reminds me of blank. So you're taking, when we went to Israel, the first thing someone said was, this reminds me of San Diego. Well, every place reminds you of San Diego, but so it wasn't very helpful to people. But he was taking San Diego, recontextualizing it, moving it forward, and saying it there. And we do it with, when I was on the mission trip this year, I was in a room with a guy who did it with media all the time. Everything that happened, it was, this reminds me of this movie. This reminds me of this movie. And then my daughter just 2 days ago was talking about her wedding. Don't ask me why, she's 17. And she told me she wanted it to be like Pam and Jim's wedding on whatever TV show that is. So she's taking media and helping it to explain and interpret how she sees things now, which is a little bit interesting because that is, we're talking about something that's not actually real. We're talking about what they call the hyper-real to help you understand and figure out the real. But this happens with Jesus all the time. And why does it happen with Jesus? Because Jesus is really cool. I mean, we can disagree on a lot of things, but everybody agrees, whether you're liberal, conservative, moderate, or whatever, everybody agrees that Jesus is cool. He's not somebody that you dislike. I mean, do you ever hear people say, I don't like the church, but I like Jesus. I don't like this, but I like Jesus. And you see Jesus all over the place. And the whole, what would Jesus do, is taking Jesus out of his context and then moving him into our context. And frequently, it's not just to help us understand things, but it's frequently a power move, because the assumption is you and I both agree Jesus is cool, and if he's on my side, then I'm right. And this is just in the last couple of weeks. We've seen this in reference to the gay marriage debate. Phil Robertson of Duck Dynasty used Jesus to say, Jesus and I agree that he hated the sin but loved the sinner. I'm as much of a homophobe as Jesus was his statement on CNN just recently when he was promoting his book. And then on the other side, you have Elton John using Jesus to support gay marriage, saying, if Jesus Christ was alive today, I cannot see him as the Christian person that he was. You guys know, if you attended one of my classes last year, Jesus was never a Christian. And the great person that he was, saying this could not happen. So I'm interested in, when you bring these things there, you're bringing all of these assumptions with you as to who Jesus is. So what I want to do with this class is move back into the context and to help us understand a little bit more about the world that Jesus was in. The only problem is when you start doing this, when you start moving in and trying to understand Jesus' context, you run into some problems. And I refer to this as digging for Jesus. When I was doing this slide, I really, really, really wanted to use the picture of Scott Walker down in the thing coming out, but I thought, I don't want to try to keep that job separate from this guy. So, but these are the sorts of things when you go to Israel or go to a museum, or if you go start reading books and stuff, you start running into some very, very weird things. You run into these things all over the place. And what are these things? Does anyone know? And what are these? I mean, what's in these? I mean, about how big are they? Yeah, they're not very big. And how did they decide how big they are? Because they got to fit this bone in right here. So, but it's a hard thing. Why are these all over the place? And they're not all over the place during the whole time of Judaism. They're all over the place for like a 100-year period, from like 30 BC to 70 AD. That's it. So what's up with that? Another thing you run into, you'll see mikvah is the plural of mikvahs. Well, I mean, we know big, they're big, a big mikvah would be like the pool, Bethesda or the Siloam pool. Those are both big ones. But these are during the time of Jesus. And again, if this happens only during a very short window of time, you find these in people's homes. This is a home and we went there just in May in Mary Magdalene's hometown. which is an amazing place. 2 years ago, we went there and visited, and they had just started excavating. This time we went, they've done a third of the city, and they found all of these in people's homes. These are people, so people could do ritual cleansing. So why is this, again, something that emerges right around the same time that Jesus is doing his ministry? Another thing we'll run into is stone vessels. And you'll find these all over the place. And you'll find them, and they use these to help identify which areas are Jewish and which ones are not. For instance, there's a city named Sepphoris, which is not far away from Nazareth. And there's been debates about how Jewish or how Gentile it is, because there are signs of the zodiac at various places, but there are also these all over the place. So the determination is that it's actually a very Jewish place. But why, again, is this going on at this particular time? Okay? And also, if you're reading the Old Testament and you decide, I'm going to understand Jesus Jew, I'm going to read the Old Testament all the way up, and then I'm going to hit Matthew and start reading, then you're going to run into concepts that you don't see anywhere in the Old Testament. Now, Jesus is fundamentally a Jew through and through. Almost everything he does is related to his Jewish faith. But there's some things that you run into with him that is you won't find at all in the Old Testament. Here's some of them. The resurrection. Where is the resurrection in the Old Testament? Well, we're going to see there's one verse in the Old Testament that makes reference to resurrection. Okay? It's come sort of out of nowhere. 2, crucifixions. Where crucifixions come from? There are no crucifixions in the Old Testament. How are people killed in the Old Testament? Stones, and occasionally people are thrown off the sides of buildings, but I don't think that's part of Jewish law. Hell. Where's hell come from? And what concept of the afterlife do we have in the Old Testament?
Fire, water.
We have one reference. We have references to a place called Sheol, S-H-E-O-L,
Everyone goes there.
and it's basically just means death. It's annihilation, and there's not much going on there. But then you hit Matthew, and everybody's talking about hell. I mean, the whole thing, Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. You people are going to heaven, you guys are going to hell. Where does that come from? We also run into the notion of the kingdom of God. And I've told you repeatedly, this is the fundamental message of Jesus. The kingdom of God means, what would things look like down here if God were in charge? We don't see this, again, in the Old Testament. It is a notion that John the Baptist is teaching. It's a notion Jesus is teaching, and it's central to Paul's teachings too. But you're not going to get much help on that in the Old Testament. 5th, Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. Essenes don't appear in the New Testament, but we all know who they are with the Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries and stuff. But Pharisees and Sadducees are all over the place. But again, in the Old Testament, we get scribes, we get various Jews of different types, but we don't run into any of these. And then finally, this title of Lord and Savior. We see references to Messiah figure, which is the term Christ in Greek, but we don't get the notion of Lord anywhere there or Savior. So when you start digging and start trying to figure out who Jesus is, you run into all sorts of problems. And during this class, I'm going to try to tell you how each of these concepts emerged and why each of those things that we just saw came about. Okay? So, our first event, as I told you, going backwards, my 3 things, we're going to start here. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to go over these 3 events. This week, we're going to go over Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the 4th Epiphanes. Again, you're going to get this down. When I go to Israel's groups, I say I try to turn you into Jesus freaks. I'm going to turn you guys into historical scholars, okay? Over the next 3 weeks, you're going to know who Antiochus Epiphanes is, okay? You're going to know it through and through, and you're going to find out that Antiochus Epiphanes is mentioned and discussed in some detail in the Old Testament, okay? I always assumed Kanye would have a "What would Kanye do?" So we moved to Hanukkah events. Does anyone know? Can you tell me what do you guys know about Hanukkah? Not Hanukkah, the celebration. I know what that is. What do you know? What do you know about Hanukkah? The emergence of Hanukkah, how it came about, why it is what it is. Does anybody know anything about it? One hand. Go ahead. You go first. What do you know?
It's a rededication of the temple that was destroyed
Okay.
under the Maccabees.
All right. You raise your hand.
They were sequestered in caves and they only had enough oil. Is that the one to last for one night, but it lasted for 7 miraculously, and so that's why there's.
Add one.
Huh?
80.
Oh, 8. All right.
That's okay. That was good. That's good.
Okay.
Anybody else? You raised your hand. What do you know?
Well, Antiochus had taken over Jerusalem and he had defiled the temple. He had a statue of Zeus in the temple. He made the Jews eat pork.
You're going to have your own class.
Finally, he was defeated. The Jews went to the temple and wanted to light the candles, and there wasn't enough oil, but it did burn.
It did. And go ahead.
Well, the symbols, the menorah?
Yeah, sure. Menorah, all of this important stuff. But the most important stuff about it is the impact of it and what it led to and what it created. So anytime you think about the Old Testament and most of the New Testament, first of all, the important thing to remember is with the Old Testament, almost everything written in the Old Testament comes about as a result of the defeat of the Jews. Now, people say that history is written by the winners. Actually, the Old Testament is testament to the fact that history is written by the survivors. These are, almost all of these books are attempts to deal with the loss of whatever, whether it's the loss to the Babylonians or to the Assyrians or whatever. That's where almost all the literature is written in the aftermath of those events. And all of these events are important. Well, I should have mentioned, I don't know if you know, there is a reference to Hanukkah in the New Testament, in John 10, except for it's not called Hanukkah. It says at the time the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem, it was winter and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. Anybody know where the portico of Solomon is? You do. Anybody else? It's just actually, it's up in the, it's very close to, you're up getting close to the Holy of Holies and all that sort of stuff. And it's interesting because we don't really think too much about Jesus hanging out at the temple place, but a lot of his stories are based on events that happen right around the temple. So it would be on the eastern side of the Temple Mount, close to where Mount of Olives are and stuff like that. So this is the thing that I was trying to tell you. So this is key to understanding a whole lot of stuff that happens in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Okay, there are 2 powers. That's down here where Africa is, the pharaohs and all of that sort of stuff. The Egyptians are the power down here. And then up here, you have the power, which is Babylon, Mesopotamia, Babylon at certain times, Assyria, and all of that sort of stuff. Certain times, Egypt is stronger. Certain times, Babylon or Assyria or whatever is stronger, okay? And when they're stronger, the Egyptians want to get up there and take control of them. And when they're in power, they want to move down and take control of Egypt. And what's the way that they have to go to get to either place? Israel is the land bridge. They can't go through the desert. They have to go right through Israel. So everything that happens in the Old Testament, just about everything, is Egyptians heading north or the Babylonians and Assyrians heading south. And it's not because they particularly care about Israel. It's just because this is the place in the middle. And this continues with the stories that we're talking about with Hanukkah, because you had first Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great dies, and his kid doesn't get control. Instead, they split the kingdom into 4 areas. And the 2 main kingdoms are the Ptolemies down here and the Seleucids up here. And both of them are vying for power. And Antiochus Epiphanes is a key figure. He's up here in this area, okay? And here's Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a good-looking guy. He was also sort of a wacky guy. His name is Antiochus. He calls himself Epiphanes, which means I am God, God manifest. I am the guy. Now that's pretty different from his predecessors. Even Alexander the Great said he was descended from the gods. He changed it and said, I am God himself. I am Lord, I am Savior. Okay? That's what he's saying. And it's something that's picked up by the Caesars later on. He was the fourth Antiochus, and he comes in the year 175 and takes control. And he is, as I said, he's a Seleucid. And just so you know, he does wacky stuff all the time. He likes, at one time he decides to, in the middle of Antioch, and to help you with these names, Antiochus, Antioch is named after it. And what does Epiphanes, what church celebration do we have that sounds like that? Epiphanies, and it's the same meaning, to be manifest, that Christ is manifest, God is manifest. And he gave himself this title. The people who followed him changed the name and called him Epimanes, which means the crazy one. Because he liked to do things like sit in the center of town in Antioch and bathe himself in myrrh, and people would get upset because he's just throwing away money, and a guy complains about it, so he orders his soldiers to take the jar of myrrh and to smash it on the guy's head, and then all these people go running around trying to collect any myrrh that was left around as a result of it. He also likes to dress down as a regular guy, sort of like Peter the Great did, and wander around, and then if he hears somebody say something bad about him, then he'll go back into his personality and kill the person. So
This is BC, not AD.
this is BC, 175 BC. We'll go through all the dates in just a second. So yeah, this is during the time in between, I don't want to say in between the Old Testament and New Testament, because the book of Daniel actually writes a great deal about Antiochus Epiphanes. So, so this is his empire. This whole area here. There's Egypt down here. Here's Israel stuck right in the middle. Here's another map that shows you a different way. He wants to head south. So 175, he comes to power. Here is dates. He takes the throne. And as I said, Daniel likes to write about this stuff, but he writes about it in sort of oblique, difficult, and somewhat confusing language. And the people who have Daniel 8, I need you to read Daniel 8, the first, and then Daniel 8:2. We'll read in a second. You've got the first one?
It just says Daniel 8.
That's it. So this is Daniel. The book of Daniel is divided in two. The first 7 chapters, he talks about resisting the authorities and being someone who's fighting an oppressor country. And then from chapter 8 to the end of the book, it's this highly symbolic language that's actually talking about events that are going on in his life. And he's actually writing this section about how Antiochus Epiphanes comes to power. Go ahead.
Then the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns.
Stop just a second. Okay, so there's a goat, right? Goat has what does it have?
Great horn.
Okay, so the goat is Greece. The horn is, and what's it say about the horn?
It was broken.
It was broken at a time when it's at the height of its power. Okay, what Greek person was struck down at the height of his power? Alexander the Great. So this is a reference to Alexander the Great, struck down at his power, and I just told you what happens when he's defeated. When he dies. His children didn't get it. The kingdom is split into 4. Okay, so it's divided into 4. Keep on going.
And in its place there came up 4 prominent horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land.
Okay, and you've got one to the south, which is the Ptolemaic Empire, and then the one to the east is the Seleucid Empire. Keep on going.
It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the host and some of the stars, and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly.
Okay, now it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes has come to power, and this is what Daniel thinks he's like, the author of Daniel.
It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one that spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled?"
And you might be familiar with the concept I just mentioned, the abomination of desolation. That's the more traditional translation. You have the transgression of the desolate or whatever. That's talking about a particular event that we'll discuss in just a few minutes. So Daniel writes this stuff, and he realizes some people aren't going to understand this, so he has an angel come along and interpret it, and they lay out, and you're going to read the second passage, Daniel, whoever has Daniel 8, the second section.
I have Daniel 8:21 to 25.
That's it.
The male goat is the king of Greece.
Okay, I've just told you that, so you now know it. I could have been an angel and interpreted this stuff.
And the great horn between its eyes is the first king.
And the first king is Alexander. Good. Have you taken this class before? Go ahead.
As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power.
Okay, and now we're moving into the four kingdoms, and now we're going to focus in on what Antiochus Epiphanes is doing.
At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue.
There he is.
He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken, and not by human hands.
Okay, so this is one of those books where you can actually tell exactly when it's written, and we'll see in a second, but this book of Daniel is written right in the middle of this time period. He's explaining what happens before, and then he predicts how Antiochus Epiphanes is going to fall, and he predicts that God is going to intervene and do something. But before we get to all of that stuff, Antiochus Epiphanes comes to power, and what's the first thing he wants to do? He wants to move down and expand his kingdom and take over the Ptolemaic Empire. So he goes through and he puts his high priest in charge, and his high priest, and he is very much a Greek. He wants to establish, he thinks of himself as Alexander the Great, and he's Hellenizing. Everybody should be speaking Greek, should be worshiping the Olympian gods. There should be a gymnasium, and there should not be any other religions around there. So he comes through and he names his own priest, high priest, for Jerusalem. And the high priest has a very Jewish name. His name's Jason. And Jason's in charge, and he starts making some changes and stuff while there. And then Antiochus heads down into Africa. And at this time, though, there's a third power that's emerging that Antiochus is a little bit afraid of. And what's the third power that's emerging? Rome. Right over here is Rome. Rome's emerging, and he does not want to get on the bad side of Rome, because Rome has just done a number of things, defeated Hannibal and a number of things. So what he does is he destroys and controls almost all of Egypt, but he allows Ptolemy to stay in charge. But he is actually the one who's running things. And so he heads back through, and when he's doing all this stuff, some of the Jews in Israel decide to revolt, something that they like to do a lot around this time. And as he heads back through, he then decides that they've now got to start worshiping him they can continue to worship Yahweh, but they've got to worship him, and he decides to take all of the temple taxes are huge, there's a lot of gold there. He decides to take a lot of this stuff when he's heading back to Antioch. So he stays there for a couple of years, and then he says, well, I want complete control of Egypt. So I'm going to need an assistant for this one. Do you mind getting up for just a second? Hopping up, yep. So he goes down to Egypt, and when he's headed down, just stand right there. When he heads down, there is an ambassador from Rome, an old guy. And I'll be the old guy, you're the young guy. You're Antiochus Epiphanes, and you're coming down, you've got a massive army with you, and you're headed down to take Egypt. And I'm Rome, and I say, I don't want you to do that. And we run into each other, and I say, what are you doing? And you say, I'm thinking about going there, but I'm not really sure. And then I say to you, he says, why don't I go back and talk to my buddies back in the Seleucid Empire, and then I'll get back to you on this. And then Gaius Popilius Laenas does a thing that we all know the term now. He draws a circle around him in the sand and said, if you take a step outside of this toward Egypt, if you cross the line, then Rome will attack you. And he sits there, thinks about it, and says, I think I'm going to go back. And he abandons all his plans. Okay? So go ahead and sit down. So that's where we got a line in the sand, where they drew the line, said, if you cross this line and go ahead and attack Egypt, all of Rome will come down and crush you. So while this is going on, this is a major humiliation for him. And who has Daniel 11? Daniel 11, I think yours is one of the longer ones. Hold on a second.
11, 21 through 24, and 30 through 36.
And I've bolded the sections I want you to read in particular. So again, Daniel, he starts and stops and he talks about Antiochus Epiphanes a lot because he really hates the guy. This incident that we're talking about the line in the sand and not crossing it, is actually discussed in the book of Daniel. So read the bold sections if you don't mind.
In his place shall arise a contemptible person on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom through intrigue.
Okay, there was actually, and I didn't get into the whole thing, there was this major fight when his father died as to who was going to replace him, and he ends up winning out. We don't need to know the details. The next section is what we're interested in.
For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall lose heart and withdraw.
That is, Kittim is the name, and you'll find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for Rome. And so he's saying he went down and encountered Rome, and it's just one guy though. That's the amazing thing. It's an ambassador who intercepted him on the way to Egypt, knew what he was going to do, and told him to stop right there. And he wasn't even, not a powerful guy, he's like 70 or something like that, but go ahead.
He shall be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate.
There we run into it again. And then verse 36.
Yeah. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god, and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods.
So again, the Jews see that he's weak, and they decide to revolt again. His response is, as you see, to slaughter 80,000 of them. And he puts another 40,000 into, makes them slaves and deports them. He also does a number of things at this time. He goes into the temple, he takes a pig, slaughters it, and has it sacrificed on the altar, and takes the Zeus, Olympian Zeus, and puts his head on the altar in there, and that is who now people are worshiping when they're in the altar. And the other steps he takes outlaws the, well, in 67, while he's away, he ends up deciding to outlaw the Torah, ban circumcision, and Sabbath observance is not allowed, and basically, this is an evidence. I mean, this is a case of ethnic cleansing, and probably the first evidence or the first case of ethnic cleansing where someone goes after a particular religion and tries to wipe it out. Now, it's not the case at this time that everybody who's in Jerusalem dislikes what's going on. It's actually divided, and we'll talk about that in a second, but there's a group that actually favored this Hellenization process and wanted to get away from doing all the Torah observances. And when Zeus is brought in, they just say, well, that's actually just Yahweh by another name. So there were some people who were very comfortable with this, primarily the upper classes, but most of the Jews had some difficulties with this. And what we're reading right now from Daniel, and now we're going to get to Maccabees. The Maccabees is a book that's if you have a Bible with an apocrypha, it's in there. We're going to read a section right now. If you're interested, Second Maccabees is an amazing and great book. It's just great to read for what happens. It's a discussion just of what we're talking about right now. So who has Maccabees, Second Maccabees 6?
I do.
Okay. So first he comes through, slaughters 80,000 people, heads up north, sits there for a while, and says, I still don't like what's going on down there. And this is what the author of Second Maccabees describes as occurring.
Not long, not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator.
A Greek. He's sending a Greek senator down.
Okay. To compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors and no longer to live by the laws of God. Also, to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the one in Gerizim the temple of Zeus, the friend of strangers, as did the people who lived in that place. Harsh and utterly grievous was the onslaught of evil, for the temple was filled with debauchery and reveling by the Gentiles, who dallied with prostitutes and had intercourse with women within the sacred precincts.
He turned this into a grove, sort of Greek grove, where you could do all sorts of things.
And besides, brought in things for sacrifice that were unfit. The altar was covered with abominable offerings that were forbidden by the laws. People could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the festivals of their ancestors, nor so much as confess themselves to be Jews.
And now he talks about what happens to people who did try to observe the law.
2 women were brought in for having circumcised their children. They publicly paraded them around the city with their babies hanging at their breasts, and then hurled them down headlong from the wall. Others who had assembled in the caves nearby in order to observe the 7th day secretly were betrayed to Philip and were all burned together, because their piety kept them from defending themselves in view of their regard for that most holy day. Ooh, nasty guy.
Yeah, and against this, so there's this 3-year period where he controls the temple. There is no temple for people to go to. And people actually have to turn inward and start doing things on their own. Either you see people going out in the woods to try to do things, or they start doing religious observances on their own at their own homes. That there starts to be, everything about Jewish life at this time is centered around the temple, and the temple is taken away from them. The focus then starts to shift to the Torah and to ritual daily observances. That's what starts happening around this time. But there is a guy who starts fighting against this. His name is Mattathias. Mattathias is out in the woods. There is a soldier who comes and tells a guy that he's got to go to this altar and sacrifice to Antiochus Epiphanes. And when the guy gets ready to do it, Mattathias, who has 9 sons, grabs the soldier's sword, and kills the guy for doing it, and then kills kills the soldier, and he heads off into the woods. He dies shortly thereafter, and his son named Judas, or Judah Maccabee, then begins this 3-year campaign to try to get control of Jerusalem. And in fact, he fights against the armies of Antiochus Epiphanes, and he defeats him 3 times. And in 164, Antiochus Epiphanes sends word back to the people and says, you guys can go back to do it. He sends word to the Sanhedrin, says you guys can go back to what you're doing, okay?
Is this the emergence of synagogues at this time?
Synagogues don't emerge until a little bit later, but there are only 3 synagogues that have been discovered that are pre-Jesus,
Right.
Gamla,
Right.
Magdala, and
But that's after this period.
actually it's not sure when. I mean, it comes in the aftermath of this, because people then start reading Torah more and more for themselves. So the response to all this that's going on, it's not just one group that, I mean, people don't all respond in the exact same way. The upper class Jews and the liberal leaders embrace the changes. They think Hellenization is a good thing. They go to the temple. Some of these people, believe it or not, try to reverse their circumcisions. I don't know how you do that. But Maccabees talks about their attempt to do that. And the fact that when you're at the gym, everybody's going to see whether you're circumcised or not circumcised, okay? So you got to fix that. You had some priestly, and what does this group become, this top group? Who do they become?
Sadducees?
The Sadducees, right. They're the ones in power who are very open and accommodating to the outside powers. And if we're talking liberal conservative, they would be the more liberal ones, because they're accepting of the larger culture and those sorts of things. Some priestly families end up fleeing to the desert and starting to enact their own ritual performances and set up a great big area out in the wilderness. And who's that? Those are the Essenes. Then you have conservative Jews who reject the reforms, and they're called the Hasidim right then, not related to us now, but their emphasis is on, hey, the priests are corrupt. What we need to do is all of us should start observing the rules that apply to the priests, and should start living in this very pure way, where we're using stone vessels, where we're ritually purifying ourselves all the time. All of us should start doing that. And who do these people become? They become the Pharisees, and then Mattathias and his son Judas Maccabee lead the revolt. They have the violent reaction, and the heirs of this group would be the Zealots or the Sicarii, right? Those things. So those are different reactions. So Antiochus Epiphanes dies suddenly of an epileptic fit, and Judas Maccabee and his followers, it takes 20 years, but they eventually take control, and they run Jerusalem, sometimes as a king, sometimes as a high priest, for the next 100 years. So you have all this action going on, and it creates a great deal of upheaval just 150 years before Jesus is born. And it has long-standing consequences. Here's as you guys were saying, they eventually come in, they find the temple, it's in disarray, they take everything out, they rededicate it, but they realize they only have oil for 1 day, and Judas says, let's go ahead and try it anyway, we'll trust God to let this continue, and it goes for eight days, and then they're able to create enough oil to keep it going from then on, because you're not allowed to ever stop the candelabra from going. So what is the impact of Antiochus Epiphanes? And there's a bunch of them. Some of them just sort of marginal, but some of them incredibly, incredibly crucial. And in fact, the last one we'll get to. One, the notion of that the ruler is God, as I told you. He put out coins, everybody had to worship him, and he is the Son of God. He calls himself Savior, Lord, all of these other things. And you'll see Caesar use those things. And when Jesus starts using these terms, it's seen as a rebellious thing to the real. Everybody else thought the ruler is actually God. Why are you calling yourself Savior? How could you? You're a peasant from Galilee. Is anything good come from Galilee? You're calling yourself Lord? It makes no sense whatsoever. 2, crucifixion. Between 167 and 164, the first Jews were crucified. This is a Greek thing that eventually becomes associated with Romans, but he picked it up from Alexander the Great and decided it was really cool, and so he starts crucifying people by the hundreds. The amazing thing is, you cannot find online pictures of mass crosses, because during the Great Jewish Revolt, 500 Jews are being killed every day, and they run out of wood in the city to crucify people. Everything online is just of 3 crosses. So I had to take this from The Life of Brian, the Monty Python. What song did they sing while I was there?
Always look on the bright side of it.
Yeah, always look on the bright side. Yeah. It was amazing. I was looking. There's got to be something somewhere of lots of crosses, and then so that's another impact at this time. The desire for self-rule. The Jews were tired of being overrun by the guys to the north, the guys to the south, again and again and again. And so the Maccabees, and they eventually called the Hasmoneans, ruled for 100 years. Even though they're heroes now in much of Israel, they were turned out to be pretty corrupt and pretty violent as well. They would go into other areas, conquer and spread beyond where they are in Jerusalem, and would force circumcisions on all men that they conquered. I mean, that's the sort of thing that they did. And they grew in power up until the year 63. And next week, we're talking about 63 BC. Two, there was this sense that things are coming to an end. And that's what Daniel's talking about. We're headed toward the end of history. Something dramatic and major is happening. Okay? The fact that he's able to go in there, slaughter a pig, and put an image of Zeus in the Holy of Holies, something major is going on. And Daniel writes about the Son of Man, and this is something that the writers of the New Testament, Jesus, picks up on and goes with. And this is what I mentioned to you, the democratization of Jewish practices. Before, much of what was commanded in the Old Testament was upheld and done by the priestly families and the priestly families alone. With this, you get it spread out to the communities. And for instance, if you look at much of the debate that's going on between the Pharisees and Jesus, it's not because they're so different that they're arguing all the time. It's because they're both going about this process of trying to figure out what should apply and how it should apply. And they have some different ideas about that, but they're very similar in that they both have this agenda of trying to get everybody. I mean, if you want to use a term that's out of its context, this is the priesthood of believers. They both are doing it, but they're saying you do it in slightly different ways, and that's what all their arguments are about. And this is all a result of the loss of the temple in 167. You also have, as I just told you, with these responses, these 4 different responses, the splintering of Judaism. Now, there was some differences between those who supported a Greek era and those who didn't. But as a result of this, people go in all sorts of different directions. If you were in my class on Judaism, you'll see I count 18 different groups of Jews that emerged out of this time. And then finally, and most importantly, a topic that you won't see in the Old Testament throughout the law or anything else is the notion of a resurrection. Okay? Who has Daniel 12? This is the first reference in the Bible to a resurrection.
Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, come to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever.
And how many people does it say are going to be resurrected?
Many.
Yeah, it's not everybody. And what it's talking about is those who are persecuted for following their Jewish faith. Okay? What's going on is, in the book of Deuteronomy, the notion of justice is that if you follow God and you do the law, then you're rewarded. It's called Deuteronomic theology. That if you do right, you're rewarded, and so are 4 generations of your followers. And if you don't follow the law, what happens then? You're punished, and then down to the generations. Well, what happens in this case? People follow the law, and they end up being killed. What they've learned and what they've grown up being taught no longer works. So what's the response? This is one of the few times in history where we see an idea emerge at a particular time. People start saying there's no justice down here, but there will be justice in the afterlife, which is an idea that's floating around. The Egyptians have a notion of an afterlife. Some of the Assyrians have a notion of afterlife, but it's not a notion that you find in the Old Testament. So in this period of time, people come up with, and there emerges the idea that there's an afterlife. And in 2 Maccabees, there's a whole discussion. There's a story of this woman whose 7 sons are performing Jewish practices, and their tongues are cut out, they're seared, they're all killed, and then she's killed. And throughout the whole thing, she's responding to Antiochus Epiphanes as he does these things. Who has the 2 Maccabees 7 passage? Okay. And this is different people talking. Sometimes it's the mother and sometimes it's the sons.
You accursed wretch.
She's talking to Antiochus Epiphanes. You're a wretch.
You dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws. When it was demanded, he quickly put out his tongue and courageously stretched forth his hand and said nobly, I got these from heaven, and because of his laws I disdain them, and from him I hope to get them back again.
So this is about that your body has been tortured and maimed because you followed the rules of the law. You followed Torah. God, and this is a case of resurrection is not about our getting to heaven and that sort of stuff. Resurrection is about God's justice, and that he's going to use your body to say, in the end, when you do right, justice will prevail. That's what it's about. That's what Maccabees is talking about. It's different somewhat in the New Testament, but that's what the message that she's saying. God is going to return these things. You cut out my tongue, I'm going to get it back. I'm not going to get it back now, but I'm going to get it back in this afterlife.
Is that tied in with paradise then?
Sure, the idea of paradise is starting to, this is all coming together right here. You won't see the notion of hell, but you'll start seeing some of these things. Keep on going.
One cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals, and to cherish the hope God gives us of being raised again by him. But for you, there will be no resurrection to life.
So just like in Daniel, he's saying, we are going to be resurrected, those of us who are martyrs, but you are not. This is the end for you. Keep on going.
The creator of the world, who shaped the beginning of humankind and devised the origin of all things, will in his mercy give life back and breath back to you again, since you now forgive yourselves for the sake of his laws.
And then she tells her last son, right before he's being slaughtered by Antiochus Epiphanes.
Do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers. Accept death, so that in God's mercy I may get you back again along with your brothers.
So the thing is, you have this major event that goes on, and as a result, lots of things emerge from it. And they're all new, things that you won't find in the Old Testament. You have the idea that the ruler of the secular world is a god and sees himself as a god. Crucifixion emerges. There's this desire to run and control Israel. And this is something that goes on long after this. We're going to talk first about the Great Revolt, and then there's the Second Revolt in the year 130. This goes on for the next 200 years where they're trying to get control of their land. And finally, and there's this notion that things are coming together in a crucial way, that that there's a climactic point in history. Now, it's not a belief like people talk today, some fundamentalists and evangelicals, that would be a destruction of the world. It's actually a redemption of the world. That's what the kingdom of God is all about. God affirms the earth and says it's mine, and the belief is with the kingdom of God, that God will control and reestablish the way things should be. He's not going to destroy it. Why would he destroy it? In Genesis, he says it is good. And that's what's going to be brought back, a new Eden. There's this, a lot of people start doing these things like the mikvahs, stone vessels, all of these things. When do you eat? When shouldn't you eat? Etc., etc. Judaism split in a bunch of ways. People become it's a very intense time. It's like a first great awakening that occurred. And then finally, the notion of resurrection emerges at this time. And that becomes a dominant theme throughout Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the next 2 weeks, this is the first one. Next week, we're going to talk about Herod and the importance of Herod and how you need, that you can't understand who Jesus is without understanding the conditions that Herod creates once he takes over in the year 37 BC. And then finally, our final week will be on the Great Jewish Revolt, what it means for the writing the New Testament, and about the relationships between the emerging Christian group and the emerging Jewish groups. Any questions?
Does the word Jew even appear in the Old Testament?
The word Jew?
In the Old Testament?
No, it doesn't. I mean, they end up using Israelite throughout the thing. And there's a debate over how you translate the word Jew in John and some of these other places, because, you know, it's a mixture of Judah and Jew. But actually, this is a case where Jewish practice gets pulled out by Antiochus Epiphanes, and he focuses like a laser on the actions. Say you can't circumcise, can't follow Torah, can't do. And in fact, they do very successfully against the Maccabees early on, because the Maccabees won't fight on the Sabbath. So they just start attacking them every Saturday. And then finally the Maccabees figure out they run and hide on Saturdays and then come back and attack the next day. So
I may have not caught it, but you answered the question about why there were private ritual pools in people's homes. You mentioned stone vessels and also the boxes with the bones. Did I not hear you mention why those were prevalent?
And I'm going to come back to them again, but what is the resurrection all about? It's about the reconstitution of your body, and you coming back bodily. It's a bodily resurrection. So you want to have everything together, so when the resurrection occurs, it's all right there. So this is a very convenient sort of a Ziploc bag with all of your with all your bones. So it makes it easier. It makes it much easier for God when He's putting everything together at the great cleanup where everything comes back. And in terms of the stone vessels, that was something that the priests mainly did to keep purification rules. That stone was seen as clean, and so you have like Jesus with his first miracle in Cana. Those are stone vessels that he's actually filling with the water and the wine and all of those things. Those are generally being things that, and Mark actually has to explain it to his audience, because people are still in transition trying to understand who uses these stone vessels, who doesn't use them. But it's the belief that everybody has to be ritually pure. And the mikvahs, yeah, as I said, people started, you know, the Essenes were crazy with the number of times that they would purify themselves ritually. And when I say purify yourselves, and you probably heard me say this before, it doesn't mean clean. It doesn't mean anything, because it would rain only once or twice out in Qumran, which means the water would stand there for a year, and you would go in and ritually clean. And the life expectancy at Qumran is much lower, probably because people are getting sick from going in, and you know, you had to ritually purify yourself there after before you ate, after any sort of bodily act or whatever. I mean, they were crazy. You couldn't defecate on Sundays if you lived at Qumran. So it's and so they established their own. It was like a whole group of people acting like they were high priests without a temple, and they believed that when the kingdom of God was established, a new temple would come. Those people would be wiped out, and they would move in and take over and run things then. So, any other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned that the Egyptians too believed in resurrection. That's why they practiced mummification.
Right.
And as early as the first dynasty, they felt that if the mummy didn't last long enough for resurrection, they carved a life statue out of wood. And there are some of those that exist, and you can see exactly what those people look like.
And what was the Jewish response to that?
The statues?
No, to the idea of that there was a resurrection and stuff. Early on, the belief was that was an affront to God. God made us. God decides when we're born and when we die, and it's His choice and he gets it right here and now. So it was seen as a pagan thing that the Egyptians were doing that. I mean, so what you get during this time is a major reversal in the way people thought about it. But not everybody. What group never buys into the notion of resurrection? Sadducees never buy into it. They say that's completely wrong. And they also don't buy into this democratization of ritual practice. They say only the Torah, we're only going to take the first 5 books of the law, nothing beyond that, and that applies mainly to us. So it's an interesting thing that goes on, and eventually, after the Great Revolt, the Pharisees move away from the idea of a resurrection as well. Some still believe it, but it's not a prevalent belief. I mean, most of your Jewish friends today, if you ask them, most of them will tell you, maybe, but I'm not really going to think about it too much.
It's more of a journey. The word resurrection doesn't appear in the Egyptian language. You go on a journey.
Mm-hmm. And you live on through your children and grandchildren. I mean, that's the main notion that you have now. So, any other questions? Okay, see you next week.
Thank you.
Oh yeah.